Thank you again for joining our webinar. Harold, whenever you're ready, I think we can get started.
All right, well, thank you. Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for standing by and taking the time to join us for today's webinar for religious organizations. The presentation is on the 10 things your finance leadership team should know. And my name is Harold Parsons, and I am the principal that leads our religious practice here at CLA. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a couple housekeeping items. If you experience technical difficulties, dial 1-800-422-3623. And all the participants are in the listening-only mode, so you can laugh, you can heckle us. We can't hear you. So if you have any questions for today's comments, we are planning on a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We'll have plenty of time for Q&As at the end, and you can submit your questions via the little question function on your screen. If you haven't already downloaded the presentation slides from our website, we're going to send you, it says slides, but I think we'll send you a link to both the slides as well as a webinar recording. They'll be emailed to you in the next 10 days, so you'll be able to have them. And finally, at the very end, after the Q&A session, they'll pop up a survey, and please stay on the line to complete the survey. We are very interested in your feedback, and we are very interested in any ideas you have on content and subject matter that you'd like to see presented at these webinars. So for those of you who are familiar with us, CliftonLarsonAllen is a professional services firm with 3 distinct business lines, including accounting, consulting, outsourcing, and wealth advisory services. We've got more than 50 years of experience in the nonprofit sectors. If we're not the largest, if we don't have the largest nonprofit practice, we're certainly amongst the largest, with over 6,000 nonprofits that we serve. In addition to serving religious organizations, we serve associations and membership organizations, foundation, higher education institutions, and social service organizations. Today's presenter is going to be Tory Lehman. Tory is a principal in our nonprofit group in warm and sunny Lakeland, Florida, and she has over 20 years of experience serving nonprofit organizations. Tory also works with a variety of churches and is currently working with the Methodist Conference of Florida to assist them with healthcare credits for their member churches. So over the next hour, Tory will cover a lot of good information. We'll discuss prioritizing learning objectives for your treasurer and finance council, identifying risks associated with ill-informed finance governance, communicating with non-accounting ministers and the like, and complying with tax-exempt regulations. So these are all things that your finance leadership should know. So Tory, with that, I will pass this on to you, and you can take her away.
Great. Thank you very much, Harold. I'm excited to be with everyone today. And while it is very sunny outside, I'm looking out my window, and it does look like a beautiful day. It's not exactly warm for us Floridians. I think it was 43 this morning. So while I'm sure some of you across the country think that that's quite warm, for us, the end of March, it's still a little chilly. But don't want to take up any more time talking about the weather. So I wanted to jump right in and talk to you about some different things that we think that your finance leadership team should know about. And so hopefully you're familiar with most of this information. Like Harold said, if you do have questions, please feel free to submit those, and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end. So jumping right into one of the areas that we see some of the most common problems when we start working with a church is the proper recording of contributions. So usually we want to ask, are you accounting for your contributions correctly? The issues that we typically see relate to the classification of the contributions in terms of whether or not there's a restriction on the funds that are received. So just so that we're all on the same page, let's quickly review the definitions of the different types of contributions. First, there's unrestricted. These are the contributions that are received with no restrictions or tags or designations on how the funds can be spent. As a church, you're able to use these funds in whatever manner is most needed. Typically, these cover your normal operating costs. Then there's temporarily restricted or designated contributions. And in order for these funds to be spent, there's a stipulation that must be met, whether it's the fact that the money has to be spent on a new building that's being constructed, or the money that was collected specifically for the children's Easter egg hunt. Someone has given the church money and said, this is how we like it spent. And lastly, there are permanently restricted contributions. These are contributions that the donor has stated they want to maintain those on a permanent basis. Typically, the donor is going to allow you the use of part or all of the interest income that's generated on an annual basis by this donation. But the original contribution has to stay intact. And so now that everybody understands the different type of contributions, another problem that we sometimes see is how the contributions are recorded within the general ledger. In order to comply with generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP, since it is a contribution, the funds must be recorded in the year that they're received, even if the donor has stipulated that you can't use those funds until the next year. Sometimes what I typically see is the church is using a liability or maybe a net asset account to record that revenue and the related expenses. This is very typical of memorial gifts or designations that come in because it is really hard to track those items. And so a lot of times what we see is that the church accountant is recording the revenue in a liability account, and then when the money is used or the expenses incurred, they're just backing those expenses against that revenue. And I completely understand the logic behind that, and I think that is, in some regards, a good way to track it. However, if you do that, you are really not going to record the activity the proper way, because then your revenues and expenditures are never really hitting your income statement. And so at the end of the year, you're not going to have an accurate picture of the total of your revenues and expenses. And so you want to make sure that you have an adequate software program in place that's going to help you record those contributions in the most efficient way. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, but those are just some very basic ways that we see contributions mishandled in the general ledger. And that brings me really to another point on contributions. You should have written policies regarding gift acceptance and make it a practice to adhere to those policies. It will help you avoid issues in the future. For example, I sit on my finance committee of my own church, and we've established a minimum amount of a gift in order for it to be designated or restricted, because it is time-consuming and it's a cumbersome process to make sure that those contributions are being used in the manner in which they were intended. So we've established a minimum amount for a gift to be designated. You don't want your church finance department spending hours documenting or tracking a $50 gift to make sure it was spent for a specific purpose. So you should have good policies in place. One of the things that I would recommend is utilizing a gift acceptance form, at least for the larger or more significant gifts that come in with some type of restriction. For example, again, using my own church, we recently discussed how there's money just sitting there that's to be used for the church library. And these funds have gone untouched for a long time. Well, like most churches, a library looks a lot different today than it did in the past. And we're currently preparing to build a new children's wing on our church. And so we're looking at ways to bringing educational materials and supplies to the children in the classrooms. And so as a finance committee, we were discussing, well, could we use some of those library funds to help furnish the classrooms? We certainly want to buy educational materials or books and so forth, and so would that satisfy the library restriction? And as it goes, naturally, the donor of those funds has passed away, and we don't really have any real way of determining if it would be okay to redirect that gift and utilize those funds in a different way. So if we had used a gift acceptance form or just been a little bit more forward-thinking when we first received that gift, we would have avoided the dilemma that we're in now. And so I would recommend using a gift acceptance form at the time that you have the original gift and ask the donor, what if we raise more money than we need for this project? a great problem to have, right? But it can happen, and so you want to make sure that you're able to redirect those funds to another project. Again, these are just good practices to have in place to ensure your contributions are recorded properly and used within the wishes of the donor. So next, have you considered utilizing online giving? I recently read an article where more and more churches are now offering online giving to its members as a way for them to make donations to the church. I mean, really, if you were to Google online giving, you come up with a plethora of information and articles about how informative it can be and how beneficial it can be to the church. And I really think this is something that the churches should consider going forward. But you have to look at it from several different angles. First, you should consider your congregation. Where is your biggest donor base? Are they tech savvy? Do they pay their bills online? Do you think that this is something that they will utilize? Because there is a cost involved. It's a minor cost, but there is a cost involved in terms of getting the software, monitoring the activity, and so forth. So you want to make sure that it's going to be something that your congregation is going to use. But then I would also urge you to look at your smallest donor base. Maybe these are the younger members of the church who do most of their banking online these days or with credit or debit cards. I know for me personally, I hardly ever have cash on me anymore. And when I do, it's not for long because my teenagers are typically taking it out of my wallet. And I almost never write checks anymore. So I typically used to find myself in quite a quandary come Sunday mornings in church because I didn't have any cash or checks with me. And so a few years ago, my church actually started this process. The implementation to full-on online giving has been a slow process. I think because part of it is you're not exactly sure how to broach the topic with your congregation, and so many people still like putting something in that offering plate as it's passed by. But it does seem as if online giving is something on the rise, and it's something to consider. One benefit that I think that would come out of this process is that it will really cause you to analyze your donors. How many of your members are giving on a regular basis? What's their average gift? Are there certain gifts that are seasonal? Have you looked at the age spread of the majority of your donor base? Is there a group that constitutes the majority of your contributions? Really, I know if your gifts are very seasonal, if you were to offer online giving, you could spread that giving across a year. Or if people are on vacation and they're not there to physically donate on Sunday mornings, then if they have online giving, it can be set up automatically, and so your contributions can grow just by that very nature. And so it can be quite scary when you really look at the age group of your largest donors. If you're like a lot of churches, the largest donor base is probably with your older members. What are you doing to address when those members aren't here any longer to contribute? Another aspect of online giving, certainly when you start to look at these donor bases, is have you met with them regarding planned giving? And I do realize I'm getting off the topic of online giving a little bit, but I think these are really important thoughts to consider as part of the finance team. I believe that you can use the data from your donor base to help guide future pledge campaigns, and then even to guide your future program planning. Look at it and figure out, are we offering the programs that we need to offer to meet our congregation's needs? I think this is all valuable information that could come from considering online giving. So getting back on track a little bit, there are many different options when it comes to getting online giving set up and ways that you can help minimize the cost of implementing. I would urge you to talk with other churches within your denomination and consider consulting with your banker or the credit card company that you're currently using to see if they offer these options. There's numerous vendors out there that concentrate solely in this area and can help you get started. And then also, one thing to remember is that just because you have it set up doesn't mean that you're done. You have to make sure that you advertise it as an option to the congregation and the members. Many churches across the area have started setting kiosks up throughout their campus, specifically for online giving or automatic withdrawals from members' accounts. And so I think that there's definitely a lot of benefits to online giving. And also, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, many of the online giving software programs offer additional services, like they can offer registrations for Vacation Bible School or Wednesday night dinners, things like that are very cumbersome, say, for the church secretary to constantly be taking those invites. If people can go online and register for these events, it certainly helps your staff, and in the long run, probably really helps your church members as well. So we'll talk about that a little bit further when we talk about technology in today's church. So now that we've talked a little bit about contributions and online giving, do you have the proper checks and balances in place? The very nature of the church organization is to want to trust people, and certainly that goes for those involved in the finance area. But just because we trust people doesn't mean that we don't want to have a good plan of accountability in place. I recently was meeting with a prospective church audit client that asked, what can I do as their CPA firm to make sure their church is protected? See, as a member of his church's finance council, he felt it was his duty to protect the church's assets, and he wanted to know what I could do to help him do that. I thought that really was a good question, and honestly, it sort of took me off guard a little bit, because at first I was like, well, I'm just your auditor, what can I do to help? But, the more I thought about it and really thought about what I should say, a couple of things came to mind, and I really liked the fact that the Finance Council was thinking that way, and so it really made me think about how important the accounting function is to help protect the church's assets. And so I think I ended up answering that question with a couple of different statements and explained that during our audit, we would make sure we were asking the right questions of the right people, sort of helped spark some different conversations on what they were doing and was it enough, and were the procedures in place to prevent loss or mishandling of funds. We would also, as part of the audit, verify that they did have good checks and balances in place. That during the audit we would probably test some of the higher risk areas like cash disbursements and cash receipts to make sure that their procedures were being followed properly. In the end, I really tried to convey that all these steps during the audit would help him make sure that the church assets were protected. And we would also be offering suggestions or best practices as a result of our audit procedures, and really just as a result of us working with a lot of different not-for-profit organizations and specifically other religious organizations. So I thought I'd share a few of those best practices regarding, proper internal controls. And so first of all, I think it's really important to rotate the people that are counting your weekly offerings. Again, especially in the church environment, you want to be able to trust everyone, but you'll also have to recognize that handling such large amounts of cash, hopefully, and in most cases anyway, does provide an opportunity for those funds to be mishandled. So you always want to have at least two people counting, and then, it's probably a good practice to rotate those that are counting so that they're not always the same ones handling the funds. And then you want to make sure that you have someone else involved in the process in terms of writing out deposit slips and making the actual deposit. The more people that you have involved, the less likely the funds can be misplaced without someone else knowing, which is really what checks and balances are supposed to do. They're supposed to help protect and provide good internal controls for the organization. And so having such procedures ensures that you also would have proper segregation of duties. For example, in the accounts payable cycle, you want to make sure that you have the proper person approving all the cash disbursements. And then it's a good practice to require 2 signatures on all your checks, or cash disbursements. The bookkeeper or whoever it is that is processing the checks really should not be the person signing the check in order just to help with proper segregation of duties. it's really better to have someone outside the immediate accounting area to sign the checks, because it just brings one more person into the process and make sure that, that those checks are being reviewed and signed by someone else other than the person that's processing them. Also, you probably don't want the pastors to be able to sign checks, at least without a co-signer. It's just not a good business practice. And, just like you would in any organization, you really should probably have two people, signing your checks. Again, in addition, you want to make sure that you have the bank reconciliation prepared and reviewed by somebody else that hasn't already been in the process, and do that on a timely basis. And I realize that, if you're in a smaller church organization, that sometimes it's really hard to break down those duties. But, get creative and think outside of the box, and have the receptionist open the bank account. Rely on a finance council member to review the reconciliation. Typically there's going to be people out there. It's just sometimes you do have to get creative in finding those people and getting them to do the work for you on a timely basis. And one item that churches, it actually holds true for a lot of not-for-profits, is that they don't seem to always have in place are formalized policies and procedures. Do you have what you do written down? Granted, you probably do the same thing every month. Your closing procedures are the same, but do you have it written down, and do you have it documented? And so I think having these policies documented will really help when employees are on vacation, or they're out sick, or someone retires, but it's going to help you to provide a good, strong basis for your internal controls. And so some of the examples of some processes and policies that should be documented are your accounts payable cycle, your bank reconciliation procedures, the way that you handle cash receipts and other funds coming in. We talked about earlier having a gift acceptance policy. Also, you want to have your payroll procedures documented and how you handle that for full-time employees, nursery workers, all the different employees of the church. You want to make sure you have your contributions, how you record those documented, and then how you use those contributions, especially in regards to those that are permanently restricted or temporarily restricted. And then you also want to have policies and procedures in place regarding your investment practices. If you do have a significant investment policy, or you're just starting to have a significant amount of investments, you want to make sure you have a good investment policy to follow, and that you're not just investing in anything, but that you're managing that money and acting in a prudent way with those funds. And so having those type of things documented really just helps give guidelines for the finance group. And then also recording and tracking your endowment funds. A couple of years ago, and just recently in Florida last year with the implementation of MIFA, these policies really have become very vital to the managing of your endowment funds. And overall, you want to make sure that you've spent some time documenting all the different policies and procedures that you have in place. And I think it's just a really good practice to make sure that you have those documented, that you review them with your church finance council. If you do have an outside CPA, let them review them. But really, I think it's very crucial to have these policies documented in writing. So, let's see. Okay, next, are you using a budget? One of the main duties of the church finance leadership is to utilize a budget and report information as it relates to the budget. But before we talk about budgetary reporting, though, let's back up and make sure that, in order to have proper budget reporting, you have to make sure that you're maintaining your records on a timely basis and that they're up to date. You should be closing out your month end on a timely basis and reporting to the pastoral staff and the finance committee on a regular basis. But if your records aren't up to date and current, it's going to be really hard or difficult to report on how the church is doing compared to budget. So if you don't already have a budget timeline in place, then you'll want to sit down with church leadership and establish a good timeline for developing the budget and having it approved. Hopefully you can have that approved and in place by the end of your fiscal year. I know a lot of organizations that doesn't always happen because, it's a time-consuming ordeal, but if you can get it approved by the end of the year, then, that's what you should strive for. So typically, I know at least on our church, our finance committee, we have a calendar year, and so sometime in the late third quarter or early fourth quarter, we're already starting to look at projections for the remaining year and looking at the results to see where we're going to end the year. And this is really a good time to meet with the finance committee and church leadership to determine, what are the estimates for giving for the remaining part of the year, and how do they think that the giving will change in the future compared to the current year, to see if there are any changes that need to be done to the budget. You're going to want to look at the programs that are in place, meet with the different department heads, verify that their financial needs are the same. Are there some programs that are growing and need additional funds in the future, or maybe there are some programs that are being phased out and they might not need as large a budget going forward? You really have to ask the hard questions at this point and really look to make sure that you're doing all you can with your contributions and that we're using our funds wisely. And I know in my church, come November, we're always typically showing a budget shortfall, and there's usually one or two individuals that are really concerned about a budget increase for the next year, or how can we plan for next year when we haven't even met this year's budget. And every year, it's classic. Our senior pastor always reminds us that somehow, somewhere, that money comes in, and 99% of the time, he's right. And the members come they come through on their pledges, and they honor what they've said that they were going to give. But, it is important to talk about that information because, it is hard to gauge how the giving is going to play out the rest of the year. And so you always want to make sure that you're communicating that with the finance committee as well as the congregation. Take the time to share with the congregation your budget to actual results. Remind them that, that they made pledge commitments in the prior year and that the church is counting on those pledges to continue the programs that we have in place, and ask them to finish the year strong and honor the pledges. And, it's strange, but sometimes it's just a matter of asking, and all you have to do really is just very simple and just ask the congregation to fulfill their pledges. Another area that, is interesting, I've seen some churches struggle, sometimes with cash flow. I know that it happens quite often and at different times of the year because gifts can be so seasonal. And so I know a couple years ago, I was working with a church and, they were really struggling with cash flow, and someone said, well, have we approached, our most significant donor and asked them if they could change the timing of their gift? And, we really never thought about it. If somebody is going to offer to give you, a significant amount of money, you don't necessarily feel like it's your place to change the timing of it. But, believe it or not, that the donor was very amicable to changing the timeline. And all we had to do was ask and say, look, we have a slower period of contributions during the summer. Do you think that you could shift some of your donation, from December to June? And they were more than willing, to adjust the timing of their gift because they really wanted it to help meet the church's needs. So often it just takes time to have that conversation with them and know that that gift comes in when the church really needs it. And so, all this information, you just really want to make sure that you're using your budget, that you're comparing it to actual, and that you're sharing it with the finance committee, the program leaders throughout the church, as well as the congregation.
And I do want to add one thing. As a finance leadership, you want to know if there's activities of the church that are not budgeted at all, where again that they're netted, where you're netting revenues and expenses in something called a dedicated account, that are kind of off to the side. Maybe it's an activity where the revenue supports the expenses. you should not have activities like that. Your budget should be comprehensive to the entire organization. But as the finance leadership, finance council, you want to make sure that that's the case, and you want to ask those questions. So I'll hand that back to you, Tory.
Okay, great. Yep, no, those are good points. So we're about halfway there, maybe a little bit closer after I finish this next subject. But so do you know when to ask for help? You know, the famous saying is, you know, I only know what I don't, you know, I don't know what I don't know. And so you should always seek professional help when you need it. But not only professional, just help in general. And so, you know, I would imagine that most of your congregations are a wealth of knowledge in all different areas. You know, anything from ranging from information technology to legal services to cooking to transportation to accounting. And so I'm sure most of you are doing this, but I would just urge that you take advantage of those resources that you have at hand. You know, ask someone to volunteer to be on a committee or to help with the finances. It's a great way to get people more involved and engaged in your church and its activities. And I say this really from experience. I mean, I had attended my local church for probably about 15 years, and I never really seemed to feel engaged. I mean, I went on a regular basis and participated in the worship services, but I never really felt like I belonged. And it certainly wasn't necessarily because of the church, because it is a relatively large church, and there were plenty of ways for me to get involved. But I guess like most people, I just didn't know who to ask or really a good place to start. And so when I was contacted a few years ago about someone and asked to serve on the finance committee, I was pretty excited about the opportunity actually to get involved in the church and get to know the church leaders a little bit better. And it's given me an opportunity to give back to my church in a way that really comes pretty naturally to me. I mean, unfortunately, I have this, you know, sick love for numbers and financial statements and so forth. And so, you know, it only makes sense that I use those gifts and talents to help my church. And so don't be afraid to ask for help, you know, whether it's a volunteer basis or a professional basis. And, you know, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say that you should consider engaging a CPA if you don't have the resources on your staff or within your membership basis, because there's so many areas regarding taxes that even for tax-exempt organizations, it really can be overwhelming. You know, case in point, Harold was kind enough to send me a gift earlier this week in helping me prepare for this presentation, and it's a publication, and I would say it's just about 2 inches thick, and it says the 2014 Church and Clergy Tax Guide. So there's so much information that you have to stay on top of, and the worst of it is that it's constantly changing. So it's definitely an area that I think you might need to seek help, especially if you don't have the resources on hand. So overall, you want to make sure that your church or religious organization is in compliance with all the IRS and other regulations so that you don't lose your tax-exempt status. You know, like I said before, you never know what you don't know. For example, some of you might have heard about the health insurance tax credit that's available to businesses to earn a tax credit on your health insurance premiums that you've paid for your employees. Well, as Harold mentioned, I've been working with a lot of Methodist churches within the state, and I know he's been working with a lot of different organizations up in Minneapolis. But really, we've been assisting all those churches file for this health insurance credit. And, you know, most churches weren't even aware that they were eligible for this credit, because the way that you file and you get this credit is by filing an annual tax return. Well, most churches don't have to file a tax return. And so, you know, it's little things like this that, you know, you can if you don't know what you don't know, you would never know you were eligible for this credit. And, you know, just in a nutshell, it's based on the number of full-time employees that you have, and you have to take into account the total averages of wages that you paid during the year, how much insurance premiums you've paid for your employees, and, you know, it's a calculation that you go through. But we've been very successful in assisting a lot of churches obtaining a good-sized credit for insurance premiums paid. And so I would urge you to look into the credit to see if you're eligible. Contact your local CPA, reach out to Harold or I. Any of us would be more than happy, to give you information. Another area you should be consulting with a professional is in relation to verifying that you have the proper insurance coverage. There's so many different types of insurance that you should be considering as a church organization. Some of them might be automobile, that's an obvious one, but property and liability, director's insurance, workers' compensation insurance. The list goes on, and it is really rather exhausting. But the good news is that's why we have insurance agents. And so you want to make sure that you're consulting with your agent on a regular basis, to make sure that you have the proper amount and different types of coverage so that the church is protected, at all times. Let's see. So talking about insurance protection, that brings us right into the next slide. What are you doing as a finance counsel to address risk management? It sort of goes back to that question that the prospective client asked me earlier. What can I do to help them protect their assets? And you see it everywhere in the news. There's shootings, abuse, other types of disasters happening that really makes you stop and think that you really want to figure out a way to make sure that your property and your members are properly safeguarded. So what are some of the things that you can do to make sure that that's the case, that you are adequately protecting the church and your members and your guests? And so let's look at some of the risks and then how you can work towards implementing a good, strong risk management plan to address the issues. So first, one of the things that you probably want to do is establish a security team. They're going to be responsible for developing emergency plans, monitoring the premises, and training of staff and volunteers on how to conduct your events in order to keep all those in attendance safe. Also, I would encourage you to work with your local law enforcement agencies if necessary, just to make sure you have the right plans in place. A lot of times on Sundays, traffic gets backed up on major roads, because of church traffic. And so a lot of times you'll see off-duty officers, or it's an extra detail, guarding traffic and so forth. But, you really want to do whatever you can to make that safe and work with those other agencies that are in your community. Next, if you have a large children's ministry or a preschool program or a day school program, you want to make sure that you're taking the necessary steps to protect the children and the youth of your church. Operating a preschool and or a school, requires compliance with many, many laws and regulations that you really might not have considered prior to running those programs. And there's so many questions to ask. Are there proper teacher-student ratios? Do we have limited entrances and exits for parents and students to use? Do you require background checks for all those working with children and youth? Don't leave yourself open to issues or problems, and try to always have more than one adult present with children. Ultimately, as I'm sure it is, in each of your church campuses, safety really should be the number one priority for all those members and guests while they're on your property. I encourage you to have regular training for staff on abuse prevention and measures, really just to help keep everyone safe and make sure that ground is secure. So on an annual basis, just continuing on ways that you can address risk, I would recommend that, you take an overall review of your transportation activities. Often you are transporting members of the congregation to and from worship services or other events. It might be that you're taking youth to camp or field trips. I know it's spring break down here. Our church has a lot of different activities planned. And so you want to make sure that you have procedures in place to verify that you have licensed drivers, that the vehicles are well maintained. And also on an annual basis, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, you want to make sure that you have adequate coverage on all your policies. It's really critical that you have the proper coverage in place. And I realize that these questions might not be something that you have all the answers to as part of the finance team. But you are in a leadership role in the church, and you should be concerned with risk management. And if something were to go wrong or a claim were to be filed against the church, it's certainly going to have a financial impact as well as many other implications to the church. So I really think it's something that, as finance members or a finance team that you should be looking at. And then another way that you can help address risk management, and I didn't have this on the slides, but I added it earlier today, is to look at your church's vulnerability to cyber attacks and IT system penetration. The threats are very real, and no organization out there is really beyond the touch of a cyber attack. I was trying to find out, some examples of what had happened, and I Google, IT threats to churches earlier, and churches come up with, that their systems have been hacked, their personnel records are now, available to the public, or they've gotten a hold of the congregation's personal records. And so if you're maintaining electronic records, then you're at risk. And if you're doing online banking, you're at risk. And so I really think you need to make sure that you have sufficient controls in place to protect your financial and your personal data. It also goes to say that you should have controls in place to protect the congregation's personal information as well. We're definitely in the electronic age. Everything is online or computerized, and so you want to make sure that data is protected. One way that you can do that is making sure you're updating your software on a regular basis. Lots of times if there's a major virus that comes out or something like that, then the firewalls are automatically updated, or your antivirus software is automatically updated. So you want to make sure that you're running those updates on a timely basis and that it's taking place on all the computers. Like I said, make sure you have an antivirus software in place. Have policies and procedures in place to limit access to the different types of software. Not everybody needs to be able to get into your church management software, possibly, and certainly not everyone needs to be able to get into the general ledger software.
I will add, if you have a minister that has a laptop and that laptop hooks into your system and has access to your database for members of the church, you have the same obligation to make sure that system also is secure, because you can get viruses through individuals that hook up their laptops into your network. So you may be thinking, well, if I protect our desktop computers here, everybody who's got the laptop that they plug into the wall they're kind of on their own, but it doesn't really work that way. No,
that's a good point. I know my husband is in law enforcement locally, and he was telling me just the other day that there was a 12-year-old, that the FBI actually came into one of the local schools and arrested a 12-year-old for hacking into a large business that was here locally into their computer. And the way that he did that was he was online gaming with a friend of his, and his dad's work laptop, was attached to their home network. And so the 12-year-old was able to access his friend's dad's work computer, and it was just a nightmare. And so I think that it's certainly something that you need to pay attention to and make sure that this is definitely an area that you can look to for professional help. And sometimes you could benefit from an IT vulnerability study, just to see, how vulnerable your systems are, and so that you can be protected, because you really can never be too careful, I don't think, in this area. Let's see. Moving forward. So this is one of our favorite topics when it comes to talking with churches and church clergy, and it's really actually a very complicated aspect of church management. And so, are you handling your housing allowance properly? And Harold might chime in here because he certainly has more experience than I do.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that people are aware that there's a difference between a housing allowance and use of a parsonage by a minister. So we have some examples, and I think given the time, we probably won't go through all the examples. But if you're providing a housing allowance, you're paying for a minister's housing costs. Parsonage, you're allowing a minister to live in a property that is owned by the church, and they are treated slightly differently. So when we're talking about this, just make sure that you understand the difference between whether you are having a parsonage available to a minister or if you're paying a housing allowance. And certainly your finance leadership team needs to know the difference, and they certainly need to know what they are actually providing to the ministers.
Right.
I'll hand it back to you.
Okay. So I was really going to talk more about the housing allowance. And so under the tax code, clergy are able to exclude a portion of their income that's designated by the church as a housing allowance. And this housing allowance is only available to those who meet the definition of a minister under the IRS tax code. And so keep in mind, while the housing allowance is exempt from income tax, it is also still subject to self-employment tax. It's the minister's responsibility for keeping, adequate records to show that they're eligible for this allowance. The amount of the housing allowance has to be declared and documented to the church prior to the allowance being paid. You have to make sure that you have good records and that you've taken care of giving them, notice and so forth before those allowances are given. So therefore, church leadership should always be approving the amounts in the year before that they're paid to the clergy. There's very specific points that the church should consider, when you're establishing the allowance, in terms of making sure that the amount's reasonable, that it's based on the lower of the amount designated by the housing allowance, the amount of the actual expenses, or the fair value of the property. And so there are certain items that must be present in order for the housing allowance to be excluded from your income. It must be used to provide housing, and there are limits, like we said. And so the amount really is an exclusion from the pastor's income. It's not an actual deduction because the amount doesn't actually get reported on the clergy's W-2. So just to pick one or two of these examples, the first one, is pretty straightforward. The church pays an annual compensation of $45,000, of which $10,000 is the housing allowance. The pastor owns the home. The fair rental value of that home is $10,000, and the actual expenses of operating that home are $10,000. Well, the church and the pastor do not have to report the $10,000 housing allowance as income for federal tax purposes. And so on that W-2, you're only going to see $35,000 as a pastor's salary. And then I'll skip over to example 3, just for the sake of time. It's the same scenario that the church is paying the annual compensation of $45,000, but in this case, there's $8,000 of it that is designated as a housing allowance. Again, the pastor owns his own home. The fair rental value of the home is $10,000 a year, but in this case, the actual operating expenses are $10,000. So that's over the $8,000 of the designated housing allowance. Again, the church and the pastor still do not have to report the $8,000 as a housing allowance, but the point I was trying to make is that the pastor can't claim the $10,000 as a whole housing allowance, even though, it costs more than the $8,000 to operate the home. Since that's what the church designated the housing allowance to be, they capped it at $8,000, so that's the most that they can allow and exclude from their income. And so, make sure in order for all this to work, like I mentioned, you have to adopt a formal resolution in advance of paying the allowance. You can do this annually or, in a board of finance committee resolution, You can state that it will remain in effect unless it's modified. Also, it's a good idea to make sure that you have the clergy complete a form that estimates the housing expenses for the year. So then, you don't have any unwanted tax consequences if you're providing too much of an allowance. You don't want to provide them $10,000 if it only costs them $8,000 to operate that home. So some of the reasonable expenses that are allowed to be included in the cost of operating the home, your mortgage payment, a down payment, home equity loans, repairs, and so forth. But just make sure that you're keeping really good records. And another point to make sure that everyone realizes is that those expenses need to happen in the year that they're taken against the allowance. You can't save them up for the next year like in anticipation of needing a new roof. Because, like I said, you have to have, those expenses have to have incurred during that year. So, I think we just really sort of barely touched on this, and it can get complicated. So I think this might be a place where you might want to seek professional help, when necessary, or changing anything to your allowance. So moving on, how does technology affect you? Well, in this day and age, there's so many different ways that technology can affect the church, both in good and in some bad ways. But when you talk about church technology and the different software, you're really talking about many different things. There's accounting software, there's software that's utilized during worship services, the list goes on and on. One relatively new software bundle, and maybe it's not new to you, but it was something that I learned about while I was doing some research for this, is that there's church management software that's made, to help manage event planning and overall membership management. And the bundles that are out there, that they can do so many different things. It was really quite interesting to read. But some of the things that I thought you might consider when you're looking at different types of church management software is, what are some of the benefits does it have? Does it offer mobile apps? Everybody has smartphones these days, or iPads, or Androids, and so most people are looking for those type of things. Are you able to stream worship services? I don't know if your churches, offer that ability, but, more and more churches are doing that, and there's websites and web domains specifically there to help with the streaming of your live worship services. Does the software offer volunteer management? And some of these church membership programs will even offer online giving, or at least offer to integrate your different systems. And so these are all different ways that church management software really could be a good investment. But then, moving into more finance-related, is the accounting software. There's a ton of different software programs designed specifically for churches. It goes anywhere from QuickBooks to Shelby to Icon Systems. There's different programs available according to your denomination, your church size, and many other factors. And so, I really would urge you, to do your research and do your homework when you're selecting a software. I would look certainly for fund accounting and make sure that it has that capability, because, most churches do operate using fund accounting. Once you've selected that software, make sure you're updating it on a regular basis, that you're getting the most recent program out there. There's nothing worse than having an old version out there and then not being able to get help with that. You also want to make sure that you can back up the information on a regular basis. It's not going to do any good. And not only do you want to back it up on a regular basis, but you want to make sure that you're storing those backups off-site. It's not going to do any good, if that backup's done regularly and then left in the drawer, the church accountant's desk, because, then it's just as susceptible to fire or damage or, anything. And so you want to make sure that you're keeping those off-site. And then another way that technology affects, software or technology affects the church today is the use of social media. Let's be honest, most of us, most people and businesses are active in at least one social media, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or LinkedIn. And, I recently read this online blog by, I think it was by Clark Campbell, and he said when looking at social media for churches, he said, you should look at social media as a tool for interaction and connection, not merely a megaphone to announce the next church program and party, but social media opens doors and opportunities to engage with people who rarely, if ever, step foot in a church. And so, you really can use this to help reach people in your congregation and others beyond just the walls of your church. So, set up a Facebook page. It's great. It would be a great way to incorporate younger members of your church and really help you get started. And once you have it set up, make sure you've established guidelines for posting material and events, establish a social media policy for your staff to adhere to, and, make sure you're, as church leadership, that you're visiting that page often, to monitor what's being posted and links that are shared. And last but certainly not least, don't forget your church website. Most churches, have a website out there. Everybody, for now, when people are looking for churches, they're not looking in the yellow pages anymore. They're using search engines such as Google or Bing or Yahoo. And so make sure when your church comes up that website's visually appealing to them and that it's easy for them to navigate. Okay, let's see. So, how to deal with your finance council. We've talked a lot about different things in various sections already today, but I thought I'd take a few minutes just to devote some communications and relationships that you really should have with your finance committee or council. And hopefully all of your organizations have established some type of finance committee or council, but let's just take a minute, hit some of the purposes and of what those should be. Obviously, the council and committee should oversee the finances and the stewardship of the church. You want to make sure you're securing budget requests from ministerial staff and other committees. You want to prepare and approve that budget. You want to be reviewing those monthly financial statements. You want to check your investment allocation and your performance. In some instances, you do have separate investment committees, but overall, the finance committee should at least oversee the investment function. Again, look at periodically your risk management issues and really look to work with other committees, such as stewardship, compensation, or other committees throughout the church. You want to be able to, in some cases, this committee is appointed by church leadership, and others, it's elected. You usually want to have your pastors involved and your church finance personnel at least sitting on the committee in an ex officiary manner so that you can get them, be very upfront and everybody knows what's going on during the year. Let's see. I know we're sort of tight on time, so, and last but not least, I wanted to just ask, are you asking the right questions of your contributions, of your congregation? Sometimes as leaders in the church, we're really hesitant to come out and ask for a contribution. I know myself, I don't really enjoy asking for support from others, whether it's work through my church, selling raffle tickets for my child's school's fundraiser, or selling accounting services. It's not just something that I enjoy. I'd much rather set the stage for someone to contribute and provide them with the opportunity than to come right out and ask, if they'll contribute to the church or purchase these raffle tickets. But sometimes, as church leadership, that's exactly what you have to do. And I don't think you have to do it every week, obviously, but, set an annual schedule where you start your pledge drive for the next year and devote some time in worship to explain the importance of giving and how the church budget is driven primarily by the congregation's gifts. As simple as it may seem, some people might not realize that the church's main operating fund is really driven by the donations received from its congregation. And I think it's important to communicate, what you're hoping from your congregation and ask them to prayerfully consider their gift and assist in providing financial support for the church. Because like I mentioned before, what group's providing the most support? Are you at risk of losing any significant donors? And look at those that aren't giving to their potential. What actions can you take in order to have them more engaged and contributing, at a higher level? And last but not least, I think I've heard the saying before, obviously, but, ask and you shall receive. If you don't ask, you'll never know what you might receive from your congregation. So, well, we've certainly thrown a lot of information out there, but I hope that it's been beneficial to you. That touched on a lot of different areas at a pretty high level. If there's anything that you have further questions on, please don't hesitate to reach out to Harold or I. We can help address your specific concerns, and I think we might have some questions. I've seen them all come up, but I haven't had a chance to look at them.
Well, let me ask you one question, Tory, that came in. Just going back to slide 1, what is your minimum threshold for restricted gifts?
I think it's a little high. I want to say it's like $100. And some people might not think that's high, and maybe I meant to call my church administrator today to ask to verify, but I remember when I heard that, that we did that, at first I was like, well, why would we do that? But then, the more I thought about it, everybody that gives a $50 gift, I mean, that could take days to track that. So I want to say it's like 100.
That seems actually low. So anyway, another question here. I can take this one. If you have excess restricted gifts, how do you go about redirecting them? And is it appropriate to ask the donor? Yes, it is. If the donor is alive, you would be obligated to ask the donor if you're going to redirect a restricted gift. And you cannot just ask a majority of the donors into a fund. You actually would have to ask donor by donor if you can. There's only one state that has not enacted a MIFA, and that's Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania has something very, very similar. The laws, the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, every state has one. They're a little bit different, but that law provides you with guidance on how you can redirect funds, and particularly very small funds. They give you quite a bit of latitude on redirecting them if they're small and they're old and they're impractical to comply with. But you got to look up the law. Actually it's in plain English. So that's what I would recommend you kind of look that law up and follow that. And of course, if you get an attorney on your board, and you can obviously ask him for help. Another question, best practices for finance team structure in a church with 2 staff members and a volunteer finance team. Can you divide duties on the finance team? And I would say in that situation, you're pretty much obligated to divide duties, because I think what your finance team is going to be acting in somewhat of a management roles, where you might have finance members reconciling cash. They might be reconciling the bank statement. They might be reviewing those reconciliations. And I think that you would treat those duties just as you would treat employees, and you want to segregate those duties and divide those duties amongst individuals. You wouldn't want to assign them just generically to the finance team and then end up with one member in the finance team that's having incompatible duties. So treat volunteers when you're thinking of restricting duties and having incompatible duties. Think of volunteers just as you would as employees, that you want proper segregation. And here I'll ask this of you, Tory. Should church have insurance for trustees, board members, or finance team members?
I think most definitely. A lot of times, especially the finance team members, in terms of the volunteers that are involved on finance committees, they're volunteers, and you might not necessarily know their financial background, but in any sense, just like in any business organization, I think it's definitely a good practice to have that. And quite honestly, if I ever join a board, that's one of the first questions I ask is, do you have directors' insurance? Because I want to make sure that I have, an added layer of protection. But I think it's definitely something that you should consider. If the cost is prohibitive, then obviously you can't. But I think it's certainly something to consider talking with your insurance agency about.
I would also go state by state and say, laws relating to protection for members of governance for nonprofits will potentially vary state by state, which is what you want to talk to your insurance broker about. What really is your exposure as a member of governance or the finance team or the trustees? So that's where your insurance broker will come in very handy. a question came up on, is the housing allowance reported on line 14 of your W-2? That's actually an alternative method. It can be, it doesn't have to be, but you can read the IRS publication, I think it's 571, which will give you guidance on that. That's actually, I hate to say it, it's kind of an interesting thing to read, only for you and me, right?
Right.
Sorry, but actually it's a good document to go through. But there's also, actually, if you just Google Box 14 housing allowance, you'll see there's a lot of denominations that have write-ups on their website on how to handle this. So it's not this is not really an unusual situation, and so you can get a lot of different perspectives out there on the web. And of course, you kind of take things with a grain of salt on what you get on the web, but I would look for well-known large denominations that have, I would say, legal departments that would be putting stuff up on their web as a good source of guidance also. So a question here on, does the church or clergy take on the risk with regard to the housing allowance? And I think both, and there's another question on here, what is the downside of making a generous housing allowance since it is limited on the pastor's income to expenses? Those are related. I think that both take some risk related to the housing allowance. And one risk that a church has is if the housing allowance is unreasonable. The church has to and is obligated to provide, but to make sure that that housing allowance is reasonable. So it is, a housing allowance in Dallas, Texas of $100,000 a year may very well be unreasonable, and you cannot just exclude that from income and expect the IRS to have nothing to say about that, even though the pastor may be accounting for correctly and taking into income what he's supposed to. If the pastor is not doing his income taxes correctly, and the church is determined to have given him an unreasonable housing allowance, then obviously the church has some exposure there. So both share a certain amount of responsibility, but primarily from the church's perspective, it's that the amount that is provided is reasonable. Of course, it doesn't say how that you define that as reasonable.
I think I saw a question, too, on where you can get more information on the health insurance credit. If you'd like, feel free to, my email address and phone number, as well as Harold's, are at the end of the slide presentation, so please feel free to reach out, and I can certainly get you, whatever information you need about it.
Yeah, I think we've gotten probably, I'm going to guess, but around $2 million in credits back for churches, but almost uniformly when we talk to churches that potentially could qualify, this is the first they've heard about it. Even though most denominations have posted stuff on their website about it, they've told them about it. It just it seems inconceivable to many churches that they would actually get a refund for taxes when they don't pay taxes. So it's not, you think of it like the earned income credit. You don't have to pay taxes to get a tax refund. So be happy to help. So we are at approaching 3:09, so we kind of ran over a little bit. So I'm going to kind of we probably didn't get everybody's questions answered, but we'll see if we can do that at a later date. Or if you got any questions, just please email either one of us. We'd be very happy to help. That's about it.